It was supposed to be a quiet evening at Kensington Palace, the kind where the walls carried more whispers than voices, and where royalty learned early to keep grief behind closed doors. But on this particular night, the quiet was broken. Prince William, second in line to the British throne, heir to generations of tradition and legacy, stood alone in a private drawing room, his head bowed, his shoulders heaving. A member of the royal staff, discreet as always, approached with hesitation but stopped cold at the sight before them. A grown man, a prince, holding a crumpled piece of paper in one hand and wiping tears with the other. That piece of paper, sources say, was not some classified royal document or a letter from a foreign head of state. It was a page torn from his brother's memoir, a page filled with accusations and lies. What had happened between Prince William and Prince Harry? How did two brothers once bound by the deepest childhood trauma, the death of their mother, now find themselves standing on opposite sides of a chasm too wide to bridge? And perhaps the most painful question of all, how does a man grieve the loss of someone who is still very much alive? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This story is not just about royal scandal or public humiliation. It is not simply about tabloid headlines, Spotify deals, Netflix specials, or ghost-written memoirs. This is about a deep betrayal, one that has left a future king broken, a brother estranged, and a royal family fraying under the pressure of stories told and retold, many of which, Prince William claims, were never true to begin with. We begin with the undeniable truth. Once upon a time, William and Harry were inseparable. In the public eye, they were the living embodiment of Diana's legacy, the symbol of what the monarchy could become in a new age. Behind the scenes, they were even closer. When their mother died, it was William who took Harry's hand as they walked behind her coffin, shielding his younger brother from the cameras and the crowds. At school, at events, even in quiet moments of isolation, it was William who looked out for Harry. And it was Harry who, for years, idolized his older brother, until something, or someone, came between them. The cracks were subtle at first. Different temperaments, different roles, and the pressures of duty began pulling the brothers in separate directions. But nothing accelerated the fracture more than Harry's decision to step back from royal life, and the emergence of a narrative that he had been forced out, treated as the unwanted spare, neglected and emotionally abandoned by his own family. It was a story Harry clung to in public interviews, on global stages, and most devastatingly, in the pages of Spare. A story that Prince William, by all credible insider accounts, could no longer stay silent about. What triggered his tears that evening wasn't just the lies themselves. It was the knowledge that Harry had chosen the world over their bond, that he had reduced their shared childhood into bite-sized accusations, omitting nuance, discarding context, and erasing the loyalty William had shown him time and again. And perhaps most devastatingly, that Meghan Markle, the woman who had once been warmly welcomed into the family, was now seen by William as the catalyst behind the complete unraveling of his brother's loyalty. In the coming minutes, we will take you deep into the personal, political, and emotional storm that has consumed the House of Windsor. We will pull back the curtain on hidden conversations, emotional breakdowns, and private efforts at reconciliation that failed before they even began. You will hear what really happened between the brothers, from their early years to their final confrontation. We'll explore the full weight of what William calls a betrayal of truth. Not just of him as a brother, but of their entire legacy. We'll examine what insiders say really went down during the Queen's final days, how William struggled to protect his own children from the fallout of the feud, and the shocking moment when Prince George asked a question that left his father speechless. We'll dive into the real dynamic between Catherine and Meghan, how the palace tried to mediate, and why they failed. And most of all, we'll explore William's raw, human heartbreak, not as a royal, but as a brother watching someone he once loved turn into someone he no longer recognizes. This is not a story of jealousy. It is not a tale of royal formality gone wrong. It is, at its core, a tragedy, a slow, painful unraveling of trust, memory, and identity. So why now? Why has William, so often the silent one, decided to speak? The answer, insiders say, lies in a combination of pressure, fatigue, and the realization that silence was no longer protecting anyone. least of all the truth. After enduring wave after wave of misrepresentation, with the monarchy being painted as cold, calculated, and cruel, William had had enough. And when private family correspondence was manipulated and public sympathy skewed, the future king did something deeply uncharacteristic of him. He let his emotions rise to the surface. That private breakdown was not just a moment of weakness. It was the spark before the storm. Because shortly after, William began quietly reaching out to trusted allies, preparing what many now describe as the clearest royal counterstrike to Harry and Meghan's narrative thus far. Not a PR stunt, not a press release, but a deeply emotional unveiling of what he believes is the real truth. One that doesn't rely on theatrics, but on memory, personal history, and painfully kept receipts. And yet, William is not a man seeking revenge. Even in his emotional state, sources close to him insist he does not wish to destroy his brother. Only to correct the record, to tell the story that has, for too long, been buried under one-sided interviews, lucrative deals, and tabloid sensationalism. The story that only a brother can truly tell. Still, this begs the question, how much damage has already been done? Can any explanation, no matter how heartfelt or accurate, ever undo the global perception shaped by Spare? And deeper still, is Harry even willing to listen? These are the questions we will unravel in this exposé. As we journey through a royal saga that has captivated the world and broken a family, we invite you to set aside headlines, step beyond media bias, and listen instead to the heart of a brother torn between love, duty, and the devastating realization that some wounds may never heal. Stay with us, because by the end of this story, you may not only see William and Harry differently, you may question everything you thought you knew about the so-called Spare. Before there was a feud, before there were headlines, palace leaks, ghostwritten memoirs, and Netflix specials, there were two boys, William and Harry. The sons of a princess who embodied grace and rebellion, and a prince who struggled to balance royal tradition with emotional distance. William, the elder, born with the heavy weight of the crown in his future. Harry, the younger, born with a different burden, the expectation to support, not shine. Yet in the early days, none of that mattered. They were simply brothers, bonded not by birthright, but by a mutual need to survive the cage that is royal life. In the nursery at Kensington Palace, Diana would sit on the floor, dressing her sons in matching outfits, giggling as they played with toy soldiers and race cars. Staffers recall how the boys would squabble like any siblings, but when one cried, the other would rush over. Diana made it her mission to raise them not as princes, but as children first. They shared a bedroom longer than most siblings of their status ever did. On holidays, Diana would take them to theme parks and burger joints, determined to give them at least a taste of normalcy. William, naturally protective, often took the role of the older brother to heart. When Harry stumbled, William helped him up. When Harry cried, William wiped his tears. And when their mother passed away, so suddenly, so violently, it was William who instinctively moved to shield his younger brother from the horror of it all. The funeral of Princess Diana remains seared in the public consciousness. But for William and Harry, it became the dividing line between before and after. That slow walk behind their mother's coffin, cameras flashing, the world watching. It wasn't strength that guided them. It was shock and grief, and William's fierce desire to hold his brother together, even if no one was doing the same for him. Years later, in a rare moment of honesty, Harry admitted he felt numb that day, detached from his own pain. But he remembered William holding his hand tightly, a silent promise that he would always be there. That moment, perhaps more than any other, defined their brotherhood. In a world that often demanded stoicism, they found comfort in each other. As they grew into adolescence, their bond shifted but didn't break. They shared secrets behind palace walls, played pranks on household staff, and found joy in the rare moments they could just be boys. William was always the more serious one, thoughtful, composed, already feeling the pressure of a future crown. Harry was the wild spirit, full of energy, laughter, and mischief. But the differences didn't divide them then. They complemented each other. When William went off to Eton, Harry felt the absence more than he expected. Alone in the vast halls of a palace that had once echoed with shared jokes and whispered stories, he began to feel the weight of his identity. The spare. Not heir. Not essential. Just next in line in case something happened. But even then, William made efforts to keep his brother close. During school breaks, they would escape to Balmoral or Highgrove, ride horses, go hiking, and spend hours talking. Diana's absence loomed large in their lives, but her presence remained strong in their shared memories. They would laugh about her spontaneous nature, reminisce about her rebellious spirit. In those private conversations, Diana lived on, not as the people's princess, but as Mum. The public began to notice their camaraderie too. At public events, William would often throw a protective glance at Harry, while Harry would crack a joke to ease his brother's tension. They were each other's safety net. When William began dating Catherine Middleton, Harry was among the first to meet her. He welcomed her with warmth, even teased her gently, referring to her as the sister he never had. Those early years, according to royal aides, were filled with deep mutual respect. Harry admired William's composure. William adored Harry's humor. They balanced each other. Diana would have been proud. But cracks, even the smallest ones, can deepen over time. And beneath the surface of their bond lay an unspoken truth. They were living two very different destinies. One was being trained to lead, every move scrutinized, every word measured. The other was drifting in a role with no clear path, praised for charm, but given no purpose. The difference didn't matter when they were children. It mattered in adulthood. Slowly, subtly, expectations and duty began to carve a wedge between them. William had responsibilities, Harry had freedom, but that freedom, without guidance, became confusion, and eventually, resentment. Still, for many years, the bond endured. William was Harry's best man when he married Catherine. They shared speeches, laughter, and jokes at royal engagements. They created the Heads Together campaign alongside Kate, focusing on mental health, a cause deeply tied to their own grief. But even as the public saw smiles, those closest to them noticed the energy changing. Harry was restless, increasingly uncomfortable in the shadow of the throne. He began pulling away, questioning traditions, growing more critical of the constraints of royal life. William tried to steady him, but the more he did, the more Harry felt judged. That divergence, born not of betrayal, but of identity, would eventually snowball into something neither of them could have imagined. The press played its part. Harry was often portrayed as the charming rogue, William as the stiff heir. The contrast made for good headlines, but inside the palace, it created tension. Harry allegedly began to feel like the comic relief of the royal family. The lovable, expendable spare. Whether that was true or not, perception became reality. And William, already under immense pressure, struggled to understand why his brother seemed to resent the very institution that had shaped their lives. According to close sources, William continued to try. He offered Harry roles in charitable foundations. He advocated for Harry to take on more prominent responsibilities. He defended him when scandals erupted. But none of it seemed to land. Harry wanted more than a role. He wanted meaning. Still, nothing broke them, not entirely, until Meghan. But that chapter, that storm, is still to come. For now, what must be remembered is this. Before the bitterness, before the accusations and tears, William and Harry were brothers. Real brothers. Loyal to a fault, shaped by tragedy, and bound by a promise whispered between two boys as the world mourned their mother. A promise that no matter what happened, they would face it together. And yet, even the strongest bonds can be tested, sometimes beyond repair. From the moment William was born, the path ahead of him was set in stone. He was not just a boy. He was the future of the monarchy, the one upon whose shoulders the weight of the crown would eventually rest. The palace staff whispered it, the press confirmed it, and the entire nation quietly accepted it. He would be groomed to lead, to represent, to reign. And so, almost from infancy, his life was charted along a straight, narrow line of duty. Harry's arrival 2 years later was met with equal joy by the royal family, at least publicly. The classic phrase, an heir and a spare, was repeated in whispers by journalists and royal commentators alike. But for the two little boys, those labels meant nothing. Not yet. To them, they were just brothers. But to the rest of the institution, They were very much defined by those titles, one a necessity, the other a contingency plan. The idea of the spare is not new in royal tradition. Monarchies, bound by bloodline and legacy, have always required a backup. And while the label might seem clinical, it often comes with deep emotional consequences. Being the heir comes with expectations, yes, but it also comes with a sense of value, purpose, direction. The spare, on the other hand, floats in a strange purgatory, important, but not essential, loved, but not needed. Inside the palace, efforts were made to avoid any visible favoritism. But over time, the structure itself created an imbalance. William had private tutors who prepared him for his future. He was introduced to heads of state from a young age. Every public appearance was calibrated to reinforce his role. Harry, while not neglected, wasn't given the same training. His appearances were more relaxed, his responsibilities fewer, his purpose undefined. And he felt it. William was the golden boy, tall, poised, serious. The nation watched him grow, commenting on his resemblance to Diana, his potential as a future king. Harry was seen as the cheeky one, the fun one, the rebellious counterpart. And while the public adored his charm, behind palace walls, that image created its own sort of trap. Former palace staff have shared that William often shouldered more pressure, more responsibility, more intense scrutiny. But to Harry, it sometimes looked like privilege. He saw the deference others gave his brother, the way advisors leaned in when William spoke, the resources made available for his projects, the attention lavished on his milestones. And while William himself never asked for special treatment, he also didn't push back against it. Not because he didn't care, but because he was trained not to question the system that shaped him. As they entered adulthood, the divide became more apparent. William attended the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, where he studied history of art before switching to geography. He kept a relatively low profile, meeting Catherine Middleton in what would become one of the most enduring love stories in royal history. His path was clear. Marriage, family, royal duties, each step carefully laid out before him. Harry, meanwhile, struggled with direction. He opted not to attend university, instead enrolling at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. His time in the army gave him purpose, perhaps for the first time in his life. In uniform, he wasn't a spare. He was a soldier. Respected, useful. But even that, in time, faded. Once he returned to royal life, the old questions resurfaced. What now? What was his place? William's role continued to expand. He began taking on more public duties, representing the Queen at international events, and stepping into the shoes he was born to fill. The crown loomed over him, not as a distant concept, but as an inevitable reality. And Harry watched from the sidelines, still beloved by the public, still charismatic, but increasingly unsure of where he fit. Some say this was the turning point. Not a single moment, but a slow accumulation of small slights, perceived or real. Harry began to view himself not as a spare by birth, but a spare by treatment. A secondary figure, someone whose worth was only measured in comparison to the heir. And the bitterness took root. William, according to those close to him, never saw Harry as lesser. In fact, he often pushed for Harry to be included in projects, campaigns, and royal tours. He valued his brother's energy, his perspective, his ability to connect with people. But the institution, massive and impersonal as it is, did not always reflect that sentiment. When the Heads Together mental health initiative was launched, William and Harry appeared side by side, along with Catherine. It was one of the last moments where the public saw the trio in perfect sync. But behind the scenes, tensions had already begun to brew. Harry reportedly felt overshadowed, even within joint ventures. He wanted more independence, more visibility, more say in how he represented the causes he cared about. There's an irony here that cannot be overlooked. While William carried the burden of the crown, Harry bore the burden of comparison. And over time, the comparisons hardened into grievances. Those close to the brothers say that Harry's frustrations weren't always unjustified. The palace's hierarchy is rigid, and the media often fed into the narrative of heir versus spare. But they also insist that William tried, truly tried, to ensure his brother felt valued. They shared private conversations, text exchanges, and late-night phone calls where William would reassure Harry, reminding him that he was not alone. But that wasn't enough. Not anymore. Because eventually, Harry stopped wanting to be valued within the royal system. He began to resent the system altogether. And once that shift occurred, even William's support started to feel like part of the problem. In private, William began to sense the change. Harry became more withdrawn, more critical, more distant. The jokes between them faded. The shared memories no longer brought laughter, but tension. And when William asked what was wrong, Harry reportedly gave vague, evasive answers. The divide grew. The arrival of Meghan Markle would later be seen as a turning point, but it's crucial to understand. The fracture began before her. The feelings of displacement, of invisibility, of being less than, they had been festering for years. Meghan didn't plant the seed. She watered it. Even so, William never stopped hoping the bond could be preserved. He invited Harry and Meghan to spend holidays together. He defended them in the press. He advised patience, compassion, time. But the more William leaned in, the more Harry leaned away. And in the shadows of their childhood, the roles they had once embraced began to feel like chains. William, the future king, had to keep walking the path, no matter the emotional toll. Harry, the spare, began looking for exits. Still, William never called him the spare. Not once. Those who've known both brothers for decades confirm this. To William, Harry was simply my brother. Nothing more, nothing less. But when Spare hit the shelves, with its blistering accusations, personal revelations, and unfiltered anger, William realized that Harry no longer saw their shared past the same way. He had rewritten it. Or worse, believed a version of it that William didn't recognize. It was then that William understood. This wasn't just about family anymore. It was about perception, power, and pain that had gone unspoken for far too long. In the early 2000s, as the world watched William and Harry mature into young men, there was a distinct shift in how the media and public consumed their images. William, the stoic, serious future king, was always under a harsher, more formal lens. Harry, the cheeky, wild younger brother, was given more latitude, his mistakes painted as endearing. But beneath those media caricatures, something more complex and more painful was starting to take shape. The differences between them, once harmless quirks, began turning into fissures. And at the center of this growing divide was something deeply human: love, and the way it altered their place in each other's lives. William had always been composed, disciplined, and deliberate in his choices. When he met Catherine Middleton at the University of St. Andrews, it was a slow-burn romance. Catherine, or Kate as the public came to know her, was quiet but strong, elegant but relatable. She knew what came with loving a man destined to wear the crown. Their relationship wasn't rushed, nor was it marked by dramatic scandals. They took their time. They broke up, reconciled, and eventually married in a ceremony that the world watched in awe. It was the fairy tale royal love story, and William was the leading man. Harry, on the other hand, struggled to find that kind of consistency. His relationships, often with women unprepared for the harsh scrutiny of royal life, came and went. He was labeled as the fun prince, the bachelor rebel, the one who would always find love a little more recklessly. But behind closed doors, he wasn't laughing. Those close to him have said that Harry desperately wanted what William had, not the crown, but the stability, the partnership, the home, the emotional safety net. As William settled into his relationship with Kate, Harry began to feel an absence he couldn't quite explain. The closeness they once shared was no longer a daily presence. William had a new confidant, a partner who understood him in ways Harry, as a brother, could never fully replicate. That shift is natural in most sibling relationships, but in the confined world of royal life, where family is often the only source of normalcy, it cut deeper. At public events, Harry stood just a few feet away from William and Kate, smiling, laughing, playing the part. But sources later revealed that he often felt like a third wheel, not intentionally excluded, but subtly distanced. His jokes didn't land the same way. His energy didn't fit with the more reserved tone of the Cambridges, and slowly he began to drift. Some inside the palace noticed Harry pulling away emotionally, even as his public engagements increased. He became more critical of royal protocols, more vocal about his discomfort with the press, and more dismissive of the institution's internal politics. William raised his shoulder that burdened quietly, couldn't understand why Harry was now beginning to question everything they had been raised to accept. This was the beginning of what would later explode into open tension. Harry's growing realization that he didn't want to play the supporting role, that he wanted a life of meaning that wasn't dictated by the hierarchy he'd been born into. And William, ever the traditionalist, could not grasp why his brother, once his partner in grief and laughter, was now so eager to break away. The irony is, William was never trying to push Harry aside. According to multiple palace insiders, William consistently looked for ways to bring Harry into his orbit, inviting him to join engagements, urging their offices to coordinate on mental health projects, even discussing long-term royal duties that could help define Harry's future. But Harry didn't want to be included in William's world anymore. He wanted to build his own. That friction, one brother walking a path laid out by duty, the other desperately searching for his own trail, created a silent rivalry. Not one rooted in hate, but in misunderstanding. And that misunderstanding began to solidify in subtle, painful ways. There was a particular moment that some insiders point to as a turning point. A dinner held at Kensington Palace, shortly after William and Kate had returned from a royal tour. Harry attended, as he often did, and brought up his frustrations about the press, how invasive they were, how they twisted every interaction into drama. William listened, as he always did, but then offered his usual advice. Stay the course, don't respond, let the dignity of silence speak for itself. But Harry didn't want silence anymore. He wanted to fight back. And when William suggested otherwise, Harry reportedly snapped, saying something to the effect of, "That works for you, but not for me." It was a small moment, but those present said the tension lingered long after the plates had been cleared. For the first time, Harry had made it clear that his brother's advice no longer held weight. He didn't want William's calm. He wanted something else, something louder, more direct, more rebellious. The seeds of rivalry weren't personal. Not yet, but they were growing. Compounding these emotional shifts was the difference in how the public and media treated their respective relationships. William and Kate were celebrated, their every move turned into admiration pieces by the press. Harry, even when he dated respectable, accomplished women, often saw his partners torn apart in tabloids. This contrast didn't go unnoticed. Harry once reportedly said to a friend, "They don't want me to be happy unless I'm alone." That kind of bitterness didn't come overnight. It built over time, fed by headlines, public indifference, and the growing gap between the brothers' lives. When Harry met Meghan Markle, everything changed, and fast. She wasn't a quiet aristocrat or a girl raised in the royal mold. She was an actress, a philanthropist, biracial, divorced, and fiercely independent. For Harry, she was lightning in a bottle. For the palace, she was a question mark. William, ever cautious, didn't discourage the relationship outright, but he did advise patience. Take it slow. Make sure it's real before it becomes royal. And Harry, still bruised by years of feeling misunderstood, saw that advice not as care, but as interference. The tension that had once been unspoken now became visible. Harry resented the concern. William was frustrated by the resistance. And that, according to sources close to both brothers, was the moment the rivalry turned into something deeper. It wasn't just about roles anymore. It was about trust. Harry believed William didn't respect Meghan, didn't trust her intentions, didn't support his happiness. William believed Harry was rushing into something without understanding the consequences. Both felt betrayed. Neither could say it aloud. They tried to maintain appearances, walking side by side during public engagements, smiling for the cameras. But the energy was different. The warmth that once defined their brotherhood had cooled, and neither knew how to turn the heat back up. The press, sensing the shift, began to speculate. Rumors of a royal rift exploded across tabloids. The palace denied it. William and Harry remained silent. But the damage was done. This chapter of their lives, marked by love and rivalry, didn't erupt in shouting matches or public arguments. It was slower, more painful. The kind of emotional drift that happens when two people change in different directions and no longer recognize the road they once shared. For William, it was heartbreaking. He didn't want to lose his brother. He only wanted to protect him from the media, from the pressure, and, in his eyes, from making a decision that could bring long-term regret. But to Harry, It felt like control, like judgment, like being treated as the spare all over again. And so, the brothers who once faced the world hand in hand began turning away from each other, step by step, word by word, choice by choice. The palace had seen many love stories before, but none arrived with the velocity and shockwaves of Meghan Markle. To the world, her entrance into the royal family felt like a breath of fresh air. A divorced, biracial American actress with humanitarian values, vocal independence, and undeniable charisma. But within the walls of Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace, her arrival signaled something more volatile. Not a breeze of modernity, but a whirlwind of change. For Harry, she was salvation. For William, she was a red flag. And for the institution, she was an unpredictable force neither fully embraced nor understood. When Meghan first entered the royal sphere, Harry was smitten. Friends described him as transformed, lighter, happier, and unusually impulsive. He spoke about her constantly, brought her up in every conversation, and defended her with a fierceness few had seen before. It wasn't just love, it was liberation. Meghan made Harry feel seen, valued, and, perhaps most importantly, chosen, not for his title, but for who he believed himself to be. William, cautious and deliberate by nature, took a different view. He wasn't opposed to the relationship. In fact, insiders report that he initially welcomed Meghan warmly. He invited her to family events, supported her attendance at royal engagements, and made an effort to include her. But behind that warmth was a watchful eye. He had been groomed to understand the dangers of rushing into marriage, especially under the scrutiny of the crown. And Harry's fast-tracked romance, from introduction to engagement in barely over a year, set off alarms. William allegedly pulled Harry aside for a private conversation, not in anger, but in concern. He encouraged Harry to take time, to get to know Meghan outside of the whirlwind. It wasn't a warning, but a brotherly plea for patience. But Harry didn't hear concern. He heard criticism, and not just of Meghan, of his judgment, his heart, and the woman he had chosen to share his life with. That single conversation, according to multiple palace insiders, marked the beginning of the end of their brotherhood as it had once been. Harry walked away from it feeling wounded. He believed William didn't trust him or Meghan. He started pulling away emotionally, and for the first time, the bond that had once withstood every storm began to erode. Meghan, too, sensed the tension. She entered a world with expectations and traditions far more rigid than anything she'd experienced before. Her background, her career, her independence, all assets in the modern world, were now seen as liabilities in the royal one. And while William and Catherine tried to make her feel welcome, the cultural and personal divide proved vast. The infamous Fab Four narrative, the idea that William, Kate, Harry, and Meghan would become a new generation of royal unity, was short-lived. Behind the scenes, the couple struggled to align. Meghan's American directness clashed with Catherine's British reserve. Meghan wanted to break barriers, speak freely, and control her own media presence. Catherine had spent years learning to say very little, to smile through discomfort, and to let silence speak volumes. The flower girl dress incident, in which Meghan claimed Kate made her cry, only for later reports to suggest the reverse, was not just a media misunderstanding. It became a symbol of the growing frost between the two women and, by extension, between the brothers. William, fiercely protective of his wife, reportedly confronted Harry. Words were exchanged, tempers flared, and something inside Harry shifted permanently. He began to see the palace not as a home, but as a hostile workplace. Meghan was increasingly viewed, in his eyes, not as a welcome addition, but as a threat to the royal status quo. He believed they were being sidelined, mishandled, and misrepresented. And Meghan, already wary of the institution, began to retreat emotionally as well. The pair became isolated, operating more like outsiders than family. The media didn't help. British tabloids, never known for their subtlety, descended on Meghan with a vengeance. Stories about her past, her family, her behavior, real or fabricated, flooded headlines. Racist undertones peppered coverage. Meghan, used to some degree of press attention as an actress, was not prepared for the relentless cruelty she faced. Harry watched in horror as the woman he loved was, in his words, fed to the wolves. and when the palace offered no public defense, he felt abandoned. William, however, believed in a different strategy. He'd endured decades of media intrusion, painful headlines about his own family, and a lifetime of learning not to respond. To him, silence was strength. To Harry, silence was complicity. Their differences in handling media scrutiny reflected a deeper rift. William still trusted the institution to protect its own. Harry no longer did. Meghan became the line in the sand, the wedge that divided not just two brothers, but two philosophies about duty, identity, and truth. Privately, William tried to reason with Harry. He reminded him of what their mother had taught them: to endure, to rise above, to stay grounded. But Harry believed Diana would have defended Meghan, not stood back. In interviews years later, he would invoke her name often, painting Meghan as the new target of the same system that destroyed their mother. And in that comparison, William saw a distortion of memory he couldn't accept. The royal family attempted to contain the storm. They held crisis meetings, assigned senior advisors, and tried to merge households in a way that kept the Sussexes feeling included. But nothing worked. Meghan, always ambitious, wanted to carve out her own path. She wasn't content being a supporting act. She wanted her own narrative, her own brand, her own freedom. And Harry was willing to give her that, even if it meant giving up everything else. In one private moment, during a family gathering, William reportedly said to Harry, "We're losing you." And Harry responded, "Maybe I was never yours to keep." That line, simple, sharp, and haunting, would later echo through the halls of the palace. The months leading up to Harry and Meghan's departure were tense, erratic, and emotionally exhausting for everyone involved. William, trying to balance duty with emotion, found himself unable to reach his brother. Harry, feeling increasingly alienated, found solace only in Meghan. And Meghan, battling media storms and internal resistance, began plotting their escape. The so-called Megxit wasn't just a logistical nightmare. It was a public declaration that the institution had failed to protect its own. And William, who had dedicated his life to upholding that very institution, took it as a personal blow. He wasn't angry at their decision to leave, not entirely. He was angry at how it was done. The lack of communication, the public announcements, the insinuations, the narrative being shaped without him. And most of all, the feeling that his brother, his teammate, his co-survivor of the world's harshest spotlight, had chosen a different side. What began as a love story ended as a storm. Meghan's entrance into the royal family had not just changed Harry. It had changed everything. It wasn't just a decision. It was a rupture. When Harry and Meghan officially announced in January 2020 that they would step back from their roles as senior members of the royal family, it sent shockwaves not just through Buckingham Palace, but across the entire globe. The carefully constructed image of royal unity shattered overnight. The very foundation of the monarchy, tradition, sacrifice, and discretion, was challenged by a younger couple who had decided they would no longer follow the script. And at the heart of it all was the emotional fallout between two brothers who no longer recognized each other. The official statement was carefully worded, yet carried undeniable defiance. Harry and Meghan expressed a desire to carve out a progressive new role, to become financially independent while continuing to support the Queen. But what stood out most wasn't just the message, it was how the message was delivered. Without the knowledge or consent of senior royals, including William and Charles, Harry and Meghan had published their intent on their newly launched website, blindsiding the palace and igniting an internal crisis. To the public, it was a declaration of independence. To William, it was betrayal. He had hoped, even in the tension, that discussions would remain private, that despite disagreements, they would handle things as a family. Instead, Harry had gone public before the family even had a chance to respond. Insiders say William was furious, not because his brother wanted to leave, but because of how he did it, with what appeared to be little regard for the Queen's dignity, the Crown's stability, or their family's unity. Behind closed doors, the situation escalated quickly. Emergency meetings were called at Sandringham, led by Queen Elizabeth herself. Known to the public as the Sandringham Summit, it was in fact a tense, emotionally charged gathering involving the Queen, Prince Charles, Prince William, and Prince Harry. Meghan, already back in Canada with baby Archie, did not attend. Reports from those familiar with the summit's mood describe it as cold, curt, and devastatingly final. William reportedly sat stiffly, his disappointment barely concealed. Harry, according to sources, looked tired, guarded, and resolved. What was supposed to be a family discussion turned into a negotiation, with press statements looming and the monarchy's image at stake. One of the most emotional moments came during a private sidebar between William and Harry. It was brief. A royal aide described it as tense, quiet, and completely without warmth. The brothers didn't yell. They didn't argue. But they didn't reconnect either. William allegedly said, "You're throwing away everything we've built," to which Harry replied, "You never built it for me." That sentence encapsulated the entire feud. For William, the monarchy was everything they had been raised to uphold. For Harry, it had become a gilded cage. And no matter how much William tried to explain the importance of duty, tradition, and honor, Harry saw only pain, restrictions, and repeated patterns of emotional abandonment. Patterns he felt the institution would never change. The Queen, in her official statement, chose her words carefully. She expressed support for Harry and Meghan's desire for a new life, even as she made it clear that they would no longer represent the monarchy. For the public, it was a diplomatic farewell. For William, it was a heartbreak too deep to speak aloud. He had not only lost his brother as a royal ally, he had lost him as a friend. The weeks that followed were filled with speculation, anger, and confusion. The British press launched a frenzy of coverage, analyzing every detail of the split. Was it Meghan who pushed Harry out? Was the palace at fault? Was this a planned exit, or an emotional escape? In the chaos, William remained silent, just as he had been taught. But insiders reveal he was devastated. More than angry, more than frustrated, he was simply gutted. He had stood beside Harry through every scandal, every misstep, every loss. And now Harry had walked away, not just from his title, but from him. The emotional distance between the brothers grew wider in the months that followed. Phone calls became infrequent. Texts went unanswered. Their once regular meetings were replaced with silence. William, deeply committed to his role, had no choice but to continue appearing composed and focused. But behind the scenes, friends say he grieved the absence of a brother who had once been the most familiar part of his world. What made the split harder wasn't just the personal loss. It was the public narrative being crafted in Harry and Meghan's favor. In interviews and media appearances, the couple began hinting at darker truths, mental health struggles, lack of institutional support, and racial bias. William, bound by royal protocol, couldn't respond. He watched as his family was portrayed in increasingly negative light, while he was left holding the silent burden of truth he wasn't allowed to share. And then came the Oprah interview. Broadcast in March 2021, it was the culmination of the Sussexes' narrative, their truth, in their own words, on their own terms. Meghan spoke of suicidal thoughts, feeling trapped, and being denied help. Harry echoed her pain, speaking candidly about feeling abandoned by his family. And, most explosively, they alleged that a senior member of the royal family had expressed concerns about their unborn child's skin tone. The world was shocked. Sympathy poured in from every corner. The royal family, already under strain, faced an unprecedented public backlash. William, who had stayed silent through months of accusations, finally broke his silence with a single sentence to reporters: "We are very much not a racist family." It wasn't enough. The damage was done, and it went deeper than reputation. William reportedly felt blindsided once again. While he understood his brother's pain, he couldn't reconcile the decision to air private family matters on global television. He saw it as a betrayal not just of the family, but of the institution they had both been born into, in which William had never turned his back on. In private, William questioned whether there was any way back. The split had started as a professional departure, a step back from public duties. But now it had evolved into a personal disavowal of everything they had once shared. It was no longer just about Meghan and Harry leaving. It was about them choosing to expose, criticize, and dismantle the very identity William had spent his life defending. To the outside world, it looked like two brothers simply growing apart. But inside the palace, it felt like a civil war. Despite the pain, William tried, again, to reach out. Quietly, through private messages, intermediaries, and back-channel efforts, he offered to meet, to talk, to listen. But trust had already eroded. And Harry, now settled in California, was no longer the boy who needed his older brother's protection. They saw each other only a few more times in the following years, most notably at Prince Philip's funeral and the unveiling of Princess Diana's statue. Both moments were charged with emotion, but empty of resolution. Observers hoped for reconciliation, but those close to the brothers knew better. The smiles were for the cameras. The silences told the real story. The split was no longer just physical. It was spiritual, philosophical, irreversible. And as William stood by the monarchy, a role he never chose, but never rejected, he carried with him the silent weight of loss. Not just the loss of his brother, but of the future they once imagined together. It was meant to be a personal account, a man's journey through grief, growth, and reckoning with the institution that raised him. But when Spare, Prince Harry's highly anticipated memoir, hit shelves in January 2023, it was far more than just a book. It was a cultural moment, a reckoning, a public airing of royal wounds laid bare for the world to examine. And for Prince William, it wasn't merely a betrayal. It was a calculated rewriting of history that threatened to dismantle everything they had once held sacred. To the outside reader, Spare was explosive. Within its pages, Harry described a world where he was always second best, emotionally neglected, and silently suffering under the weight of royal protocol. He accused members of his family, though sometimes without naming them directly, of cruelty, complicity, and betrayal. He recounted physical altercations, internal rifts, media manipulation, and systemic silence. It wasn't a story of reconciliation, it was a declaration of war. And William was cast as the primary antagonist. The book began with memories from childhood, the same childhood they had shared. But what struck William most was not the stories themselves, but the lens through which they were told. Familiar events were reshaped, interpreted through bitterness, colored by years of festering pain. Harry described their bond as one of hierarchy, not brotherhood, painting himself as the cast-off, the backup, the lesser. William, who had protected Harry through school scandals, teenage rebellion, and the pressures of royal life, was now being framed as distant, arrogant, even violent. One of the most damaging allegations was Harry's claim that William physically attacked him during a confrontation about Meghan. The book detailed how William had allegedly grabbed his collar, ripped his necklace, and knocked him to the ground. To readers, it was a dramatic, cinematic moment. Two princes, once inseparable, now reduced to violence. But to William, it was a moment taken out of context, twisted for narrative, and presented without the emotional nuance that had truly defined it. According to those close to William, the incident, while heated, had not unfolded the way Harry described. It was a moment of frustration, yes, but also one of deep pain, miscommunication, and years of unresolved tension. That Harry had chosen to share it publicly, without warning, left William reeling. He wasn't just hurt, he was humiliated. The image of him as a bully, pushed out to millions of readers, contradicted the man he saw in himself and the brother he believed he had always tried to be. Worse still was Harry's claim that William had ignored his cries for help. That when he and Meghan struggled, William had closed the door, refused to listen, and stood with the institution instead of his own flesh and blood. For William, who had spent countless hours trying to bridge the gap, trying to keep Harry grounded, the accusation felt cruelly unfair. He had not turned his back. He had simply been unable to follow Harry down the path he'd chosen. Throughout Spare, the narrative was unrelenting. Charles was depicted as emotionally distant. Camilla was framed as scheming. Kate, once seen as a sisterly figure, was now cold, unwelcoming, and formal. And William was the polished mask of the monarchy, the golden child who never questioned the rules, who upheld the very structure Harry believed had destroyed his happiness. It wasn't just painful, it was devastating. Within the palace, there was shock. But more than that, there was silence. Following tradition, the royal family refused to issue a direct response. Never complain, never explain remained the rule. But behind palace doors, the emotions were volcanic. Staffers described William walking the halls of Kensington Palace pale-faced, holding printouts of key passages, shaking his head in disbelief. He couldn't understand how their shared experiences, their childhood games, their nights spent talking about Diana, Their joint initiatives had been reduced to sound bites of resentment. For Catherine, the hurt ran deep too. She had embraced Harry like a brother. They had shared laughs, dinners, holidays. She had watched over him during his wild years, stood by him when he introduced Meghan, and even reportedly cried during some of their final family discussions. But in Spare, she became a symbol of everything cold and traditional, the opposite of the freedom Meghan represented. She was, in many ways, collateral damage in a story she hadn't written. Perhaps most painful was the book's title itself, Spare. It implied a lifetime of insignificance, that Harry saw himself as unnecessary, replaceable, and that belief, born of years of internal conflict, had now become his truth. For William, who had always tried to treat Harry as his equal, not his subordinate, it was the final twist of the knife. Harry didn't just feel excluded. He had never felt included to begin with. The media reaction was swift and polarized. Some hailed Harry's bravery, his willingness to speak his truth, to challenge centuries of royal silence. Others saw it as petty, vengeful, and damaging, a public relations disaster for the monarchy and a tragic confirmation of the family's brokenness. Amid all the noise, William remained quiet. But those closest to him say he was not okay. He reportedly told a friend, "This isn't the brother I grew up with. I don't know this version of him." Behind the walls of Windsor and Kensington, meetings were held. Advisors scrambled to assess the fallout. The Queen had passed months earlier, and now King Charles faced one of the greatest image crises of his reign. But it was William who bore the deepest bruise, not just as a future king, but as a brother. Because beyond all the politics, beyond the headlines, what was lost in Spare was the heart of a relationship that had once been the strongest in the royal family. William and Harry had survived so much together. Their mother's death, their father's remarriage, the pressures of fame, and the rigid demands of duty. And now, all of that was undone. In just under 400 pages, people began to ask, was there any hope for reconciliation? Could William and Harry ever rebuild trust? Or had the memoir become a point of no return? Those questions lingered, unanswered, heavy. And as William sat in quiet reflection, staring at the words his brother had written, words that millions had read and accepted as gospel, he felt a sadness too great to express. Because no matter how many times he tried to explain, no matter how much truth he believed he held, he knew he could never undo what had been published. The story had been told. The world had chosen sides. And in the court of public opinion, perception mattered more than memory. For all the focus on William and Harry, much of the tension that fractured the royal family unfolded in the shadow dynamic between two women who were never meant to be rivals, but who never managed to become allies either. Catherine, Princess of Wales, refined, cautious, the living embodiment of royal restraint. Meghan Markle, outspoken, ambitious, the disruptor who never wanted to play by royal rules. To the public, they were icons of elegance and modernity. But behind palace doors, the relationship between Kate and Meghan was far more complicated, and it quickly became one of the most emotionally charged elements of the royal saga. When Harry first introduced Meghan to the family, Kate was reportedly cordial and gracious. By all accounts, she made an effort to welcome Meghan into the fold, aware of the pressures the American actress would face entering the world's most scrutinized family. But Catherine was also a product of the institution. A woman who had spent nearly a decade being molded, scrutinized, and prepared before finally marrying into the firm. She had learned how to survive the cold structures of palace life by moving silently, mastering subtlety, and embodying patience. Meghan, however, came from an entirely different world, one where directness was valued, where emotion was shown rather than suppressed, and where status was earned rather than inherited. She was used to fast-paced media cycles, individual branding, and standing out. In a world like Hollywood, she had thrived. In the stiff, ceremonial halls of Kensington Palace, she felt confined. The initial cracks began with a series of small misunderstandings. Meghan found the formality of royal events, and even personal family gatherings, stifling. Where she expected casual intimacy, she often found protocol. Meghan would later remark that she was surprised to learn the formality carried over into private life. For Catherine, that formality wasn't pretense, it was protection. an armor she had built to survive the relentless pressures of royal expectation. Perhaps the most infamous incident came in the lead-up to Harry and Meghan's wedding. The now heavily scrutinized bridesmaid dress debacle involving Princess Charlotte. Initial reports claimed Meghan made Kate cry, but Meghan later revealed that, in her telling, it was the other way around. She stated during her Oprah interview that Kate had made her cry over the dresses, but had since apologized and brought her flowers. Meghan claimed she had forgiven her. But by the time the public heard the story, the damage was done. Headlines painted Meghan as difficult. Kate remained silent. The truth behind the tears, whether Meghan's or Catherine's, may never fully be known. But what the incident laid bare was a deeper cultural and emotional divide. Meghan expected confrontation followed by clarity. Catherine, raised in an environment of discretion, saw such moments as private, not to be aired publicly. When Meghan later referenced the story on global television, many within the royal family saw it as a breach of trust, especially William. To William, Catherine was not only his wife, but also his anchor. He knew better than anyone how hard she had worked to fulfill her role, how many years she had endured the spotlight without complaint, and how fiercely protective she was of their children. He resented the suggestion that she had bullied Meghan. He resented, more deeply, that Meghan had brought private disagreements into the public realm. In his view, Meghan had broken an unspoken royal code, not just by challenging protocol, but by rewriting private moments into public scandal. The result? Catherine was portrayed as cold, aloof, even unfriendly, and William took that personally. From Meghan's perspective, the issue was more than cultural, it was emotional. She felt unsupported. She expected camaraderie and sisterhood. But what she encountered, she claimed, was distance, silence, and a refusal to engage. To Meghan, it felt like rejection. To Catherine, it may have simply been restraint. The emotional weight of these misunderstandings fell on Harry and William. Caught between their wives and their own unraveling bond, they struggled to navigate loyalty, truth, and diplomacy. Harry reportedly believed that William and Kate never made enough effort to embrace Meghan. He viewed their caution as coldness, their silence as judgment. William, in turn, believed Meghan had disrupted not only his brother's world but their own. Palace staffers recall a growing tension between the two households. Meghan and Harry's team operated differently, more American, more media-savvy, more assertive. Catherine's team had been trained in the old ways, favoring silence, tradition, and slow diplomacy. The contrast in approach widened the gulf. Communication became strained. Meetings were awkward. Joint appearances turned stiff. What was once sold as the Fab Four quickly became four individuals moving in separate directions. The public, for a time, didn't see the fracture. William and Catherine continued their duties. Meghan and Harry, initially, did the same. But behind the scenes, Meghan felt increasingly isolated. She reportedly confided in Harry that she felt unwelcome, not just by the institution, but by the family itself. Harry, emotionally bound to Meghan and increasingly disillusioned with his role, began to withdraw further from his brother. It was during this period that Meghan and Harry began exploring the possibility of a new life, outside the constraints of the royal system. The discussions were quiet at first, but the foundation had already crumbled. William saw it all happening but felt powerless to stop it. Every attempt to bridge the gap seemed to backfire. His wife, once a symbol of calm and unity, was now viewed by Harry and Meghan as emblematic of the very structure they were trying to escape. And Catherine, deeply private and emotionally reserved, struggled with the public scrutiny being leveled at her without the chance to respond. There's a tragic irony in all of this. Neither Meghan nor Catherine ever asked for the role of antagonist. Both were caught in a storm of expectation, culture clash, and media obsession. Both were women trying to protect their families in very different ways. But in the drama that unfolded, nuance was lost. Catherine became the face of icy tradition. Meghan became the face of modern rebellion. And the palace, long known for silence, watched as the story was told for them. To this day, William reportedly maintains that Catherine did everything she could to be kind, to be welcoming, to support the family. And Meghan, through her own words, continues to express that what she needed. Emotional openness, shared understanding, was never offered. the sisterhood that many hoped for never materialized. And the tension between Meghan and Catherine became not only a media fixation, but a fault line that mirrored the deeper rupture between William and Harry. There is a dangerous illusion that comes with being royal, the belief that silence is strength and that appearances matter more than authenticity. Nowhere was that illusion more pronounced than in the split public personas of William and Harry during the height of their rift. To the world, William seemed calm, collected, regal, a man gracefully stepping into his role as the future king. Harry appeared animated, outspoken, emotionally raw, challenging centuries of tradition with every interview. But behind these curated facades, both men were in turmoil. The burden of perception had become a second prison, and it was taking its toll. William, raised from childhood to embody stability, had long been taught to keep personal struggles behind palace walls. Never complain, never explain wasn't just a motto, it was a requirement. As his younger brother unleashed emotional truths across global platforms, William was bound to silence. His hands were tied by duty, tradition, and his deep commitment to protecting the monarchy's image. But the silence, however noble in the eyes of royal loyalists, came at a personal cost. Friends close to William described those years as some of the most emotionally taxing of his life. He wasn't just dealing with the institutional strain of a royal family under siege. He was grieving the loss of a brother still very much alive. Every interview, every public slight, every new revelation from Harry widened the wound. Yet when the cameras turned on him, William smiled. He waved. He posed with Catherine and their children. And the public, or at least parts of it, applauded his composure. But inside, he was breaking. He confided in a close friend that it felt like being trapped between two burning buildings. On one side, his duty to the crown, a centuries-old institution that demanded he represent calm no matter the chaos. On the other, his emotional connection to a brother who now seemed determined to tear that institution down. He didn't know how to be both prince and person. So, like so many royals before him, he chose the mask. Harry, on the other hand, chose the megaphone. In the years following his and Meghan's departure from royal life, Harry transformed into a symbol of disruption. He gave interviews, launched media deals, and spoke openly about the pain he claimed to have endured within the royal family. In one breath, he praised William as the only person who truly understood their shared trauma. In the next, he painted him as complicit in the very system that created it. To Harry, these contradictions were not lies, but reflections of internal conflict. He still loved his brother, but he no longer trusted him. And more than that, he didn't trust the institution that William had chosen to stand by. In a moment of searing honesty during the Oprah interview, Harry said he felt really let down by William, that he expected support but received silence. The public had never seen anything like it. A prince speaking about family trauma, about feeling trapped, about questioning whether his own family had protected his wife. It was raw, emotional, and powerful, and yet, it also created a split in public opinion that persists to this day. Some saw Harry as brave, finally voicing the unspoken. Others viewed him as disloyal, airing family grievances for profit and attention. William, still bound by protocol, couldn't respond in kind. His team issued short, measured statements. His body language during public events became the only outlet for his pain. And it was there, in the tightness of his jaw, the hollowness of his eyes, the stiffness of his posture, that the private struggle bled into public view. There was one event that particularly symbolized this contrast between public image and private pain: the unveiling of Princess Diana's statue in the summer of 2021. William and Harry appeared together for the first time in months. They smiled for the cameras. They stood side by side. They walked the garden paths of Kensington Palace like old times. But it wasn't old times. Not even close. Observers noted the lack of casual conversation, the absence of spontaneous laughter that once marked their appearances. It was professional, cordial, hollow. Behind the scenes, it was even colder. There had been no substantial reconciliation, no meaningful conversation. The event was a performance, a necessary gesture in honor of their mother, not a signal of healed wounds. And yet, even in that carefully managed moment, William's grief was visible. Grief not just for Diana, but for Harry. The brother he had once walked these very gardens with in childhood now felt like a stranger beside him. They had once shared memories, secrets, and pain. Now they shared only silence. The media continued to draw comparisons between them, William the dutiful royal, Harry the rogue. But those comparisons, while compelling, missed the deeper tragedy. Both men were suffering. Both were lost in roles neither had fully chosen. And both were caught in a public spectacle that demanded simplicity when the truth was anything but. For William, the weight of the monarchy became heavier with every passing month. As his father ascended to the throne, William moved closer to his own future as king. But instead of excitement or anticipation, those around him describe a man burdened by the pressure of carrying forward a legacy already battered by scandal. He wasn't just preparing to inherit a crown. He was fighting to preserve its credibility in the face of a brother who had cast doubt on its soul. There were nights, aides say, when William would walk the halls of Adelaide Cottage or Kensington Palace long after his children had gone to bed, rereading transcripts, watching clips, searching for something, some sliver of understanding, some bridge he could rebuild. But every time he reached out, the divide seemed to widen. Meanwhile, Harry, across the ocean, was facing his own reckoning. The media attention he once hoped would bring clarity now felt suffocating. The very platforms that allowed him to tell his truth became battlegrounds for criticism. He was praised, then mocked, heard, then dismissed. The cost of freedom, it turned out, was loneliness, a different kind than what he had felt in the palace, but loneliness nonetheless. Public image had become a performance on both sides. William's role was to stand tall, represent stability, and never waver. Harry's was to challenge, provoke, and reveal. But in the quiet moments, away from the cameras, the headlines, and the carefully crafted narratives, both men were simply brothers in pain. And what no headline ever captured was this. Behind the public personas were two boys who had once clung to each other at their mother's funeral, who had shared a childhood filled with palace walls and whispered memories. Now, they stood on opposite ends of a battlefield neither had chosen, speaking through silence, accusations, and years of unmet emotional needs.